right, anybody who's here and isn't seated ought to find a seat at some point in the near future. Good afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Kevin Graffinino. I'm the director of the Clements Library. Got a couple of housekeeping details before I introduce our speakers. Most of you should have received this in the mail. It's a large postcard, lists all of our events for this semester. If you don't have one, I believe we have some on the back, on the tables behind you. We think we've put together a pretty good range of interesting speakers for you for the semester, so I hope to see most of you at most of the events. Permit me to add, as I often do when I'm the one doing the introducing, that I also expect to see any of you who are not yet dues-paying members of the Clements Library Associates. I expect to see all of you joining said august organization in the near future so that you can hold your heads high in decent society. The associates are now entering their 8th decade of support for the Clements Library. Folks who are members deserve and get our tremendous respect and appreciation, because without the associates, the collections of the library would be infinitely poorer than they are. The associates have probably added somewhere in the range of $100 million worth of material to the Clements collections in the last 70 years. So, those of you who have consciences will want to reach for a cookie and a glass of punch in the back and grab a membership envelope or form at the same time. Those of you who are already members, of course, will want to empty your purses and wallets in appreciation of the opportunity we've given you. Today's speakers are Cheney, Schopieray, and Tessa Wakefield. Most of you know Cheney already, I presume. Michigan native, undergraduate and graduate degrees, employed at the Clements for more than a dozen years now, if we count his student work for us, and he is the head of our Manuscripts division. Tessa Wakefield is from Moorhead, Minnesota. She is a 2014 graduate of Concordia College and is currently a second-year graduate student in the School of Information, where she is specializing in archives and records management. And Tessa spent the summer of 2016 working virtually full-time on the Weld-Grimke papers at the Clements. The Weld-Grimke archive is one of the finest archives on this planet for the study of the anti-slavery movement, the women's rights movement, and other reform movements of the antebellum decades in this country. It has brought distinguished scholars to Ann Arbor now for more than half a century, including luminaries like Gerda Lerner and some of the other great historians of our generation. Cheney and Tessa are here to remind us why that is so, and their title for the presentation is A Family of Reformers, the Weld-Grimke Manuscript Collection. So please join me, if you will, in welcoming Cheney and Tessa to the podium.
Cheney first, then Tessa. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for coming out on this unseasonable rainy winter day to join us in celebrating an extraordinary addition of 961 letters to an already extraordinary archive of papers, publications, photographs, objects of the Grimke and Weld families. First, I'd like to express deep and sincere appreciation to the donor of the new edition, Thomas Mason, whose mother, Charlotte Hamilton Mason, made a concerted effort to secure and save letters and other family materials from her aunt, Angelina Grimké Hamilton, granddaughter of Angelina Grimké and Theodore Weld. We'd like to acknowledge also the dedication of volunteer Kay Miller, who for 2 years waited and struggled through the often challenging handwriting of Theodore Weld, who provided our first glimpse at the contents of the edition and who helped document the original order of the bundled letters. We'd also like to acknowledge the generosity of 3 private donors who funded a graduate internship to process the edition and create a writer index for the complete Weld-Grimke correspondence held by the Clements Library. and University of Michigan graduate student Tessa Wakefield will speak about her work shortly. Yep. Oh dear. Immediate troubles. All right, here. There we are. There. The subject of today's presentation is this box on the lower left and its former contents. The box is sitting there on a book cart off to the side. This is a box that was presented by Tom Mason that I'd mentioned and who we thanked at the beginning of the conversation. In it were stacks and stacks of folded letters bundled with strings. For those of you who are passionate about original, primary source materials, you might imagine the excitement of the occasion, particularly as the handwriting of Sarah Moore Grimké was discernible at the top of multiple bundles. The crate shipping label is dated 1940, sender A.G. Hamilton to Miss Charlotte Hamilton. Now, the Clements Library has cared for the papers of the Weld and Grimké family since the late 1930s. And at a glance, this crate seemed to contain an extension of this valuable research collection. If possible, in brief, who were the Grimkes and Welds? Angelina and Sarah Grimké were born in South Carolina to John Grimké and Mary Smith. Grimké was a Revolutionary War veteran and a judge in the South Carolina Supreme Court. And Smith was a well-connected Charleston woman, and the couple owned a plantation and slaves outside the city. John and Mary had 14 children, including Angelina and Sarah. Sarah and Angelina Grimké received limited formal education as children, but Sarah in particular expanded her knowledge with the help of her brother Thomas, who shared his lessons with her. The two were raised Episcopalian, taught Sunday school, and held daily prayer meetings for the household slaves. Against their parents' wishes, they also taught several slaves to read and write. Sarah Grimké joined the Society of Friends and moved to Philadelphia in 1821, and her sister Angelina converted to Presbyterianism before converting to the Quaker faith and joined Sarah in Philadelphia in 1829. The sisters strongly disapproved of slavery, having witnessed firsthand in their childhood home some of the harsh realities of plantation slavery. Following a pro-slavery riot in Boston in 1835, Angelina wrote a letter to William Lloyd Garrison, who published it in his newspaper, The Liberator, beginning her anti-slavery career. Both sisters then began to write regularly in service of abolitionism. In 1837, they went on a rigorous whirlwind speaking tour of over 60 northern cities, knitting together the anti-slavery message with arguments for equality between the sexes. Here are two examples of the sisters' publications held by the Clements Library. Angelina Grimké married Theodore Dwight Weld, who she described as the lion of the tribe of abolition. Theodore Weld spent his early life in Pompey, New York, with inspiration and influence by Charles G. Finney, the revivalist preacher, and abolitionist Charles Stewart. Weld determined to become an abolitionist. He befriended Arthur and Lewis Tappan, joined the American Anti-Slavery Society, and went to study at Lane Seminary in Cincinnati, where Weld and some 40 other students were dismissed for holding anti-slavery debates in 1834. He became an agent for the American Anti-Slavery Society and became a highly skilled and highly sought-after speaker, particularly notable for his ability to subdue angry and violent pro-slavery mobs. Among Weld's many publications was American Slavery as It Is, the testimony of 1,000 witnesses based in part on research compiled by Angelina and Sarah. Along with Sarah, Theodore and Angelina moved to New Jersey. The family adopted the diet of Sylvester Graham, who advocated a generally sparse lifestyle. And in 1840, the family purchased property in Belleville, New Jersey, where they took up farming and later opened a school. However, the school and the family struggled financially, and in 1853, they joined the Raritan Bay Union, a utopian community near Perth Amboy, whose goals were to correct social inequalities and to save money by collective labor. There, Sarah, Angelina, and Theodore taught at the Eagleswood School. In 1864, they relocated to Hyde Park, Massachusetts. Theodore continued to speak in public on issues of women's rights and other subjects, and both sisters continued to advocate for social equality in various ways through the remainder of their lives. This is a draft of a family tree of the Grimke, Weld, and Hamilton families in black. And Sarah Grimké, John and Mary's 14 children are on two lines here, but Sarah is in red at the top, Angelina in red in the middle. And you'll forgive me, this is a draft that's been annotated in pencil by my one-year-old daughter and crumpled as well. I vowed that I would reconstruct this in a formal manner before the presentation, but it simply didn't happen. So if you look at Angelina, who married Theodore Weld, they had three children, Charles Weld, Theodore Weld, and Sarah Grimké Weld. Theodore went by Sody, Charles went by Stewart, and Sarah went by Sissy. Charles was a Harvard graduate of 1863 and a conscientious objector during the Civil War. Sody showed signs of intellectual promise in his younger years, but as a teenager was afflicted with physical ailments and showed signs of mental illness. In an effort to help cure Sody, Angelina and Theodore arranged or considered meetings with religious leaders, doctors, and clairvoyants. At length, and with much debate, the family institutionalized Sody at the Westboro Insane Hospital in Massachusetts in 1900. Sarah Grimké Weld, whom Gerda Lerner described as, I quote, the least troublesome and the most normal of the Weld's children, worked as a clerk in the Women's Journal offices beginning in 1870, and she became a member of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. She married William Hamilton, whose troubled employment history and nervous disposition prompted much concern from her parents. Sarah Weld Hamilton and her husband had 4 children, including Angelina Grimké Hamilton. Hamilton earned a medical degree at Hahnemann Medical College and Hospital in Chicago, 1896, and a University of Michigan medical degree in 1908, before working for almost 40 years as a psychiatrist in the Illinois State Mental Hospital System. And she spent some of these years working at the Anna State Hospital in Anna, Illinois as a physician. Now, if you could pay attention to the colored portions of the chart, the square blocks show the movement of groups of the Weld and Grimké family papers. If we begin at the upper middle, you have Sarah Moore Grimké. She had her correspondence, her manuscripts, and her writings. And on her death in 1873, those papers were inherited by her sister and her husband, Angelina and Theodore. And those papers, in turn, were inherited by their son, Charles, and again, to Lewis Weld, Angelina and Theodore's grandson. In 1930, Gilbert H. Barnes completed his dissertation in the history department at the University of Michigan under the instruction of Ulrich B. Phillips. Sometime in the 1920s, Barnes had uncovered a large and compelling archive of papers of Sarah Grimké, Angelina Grimké, and Theodore Weld, owned by Lewis Weld. In the early 1930s, Barnes set to work beside University of Michigan graduate student Dwight L. Dumond to transcribe selected letters from Weld's family papers, resulting in the publication of 339 of them in 1934. The 2-volume work, Letters of Theodore Dwight Weld, Angelina Grimké Weld, and Sarah Grimké, 1822 to 1844. Now, while Barnes would go on to teach economics at Wesleyan College, Dumond succeeded Ulrich Phillips in the history department at Michigan. And in 1938 and 1939, Dumond worked with Lewis Weld and with Clements Library director Randolph G. Adams and Manuscripts curator Howard Peckham to bring the Weld-Grimke family papers to the Clements Library. This collection consisted of around 2,000 letters, dozens of notebooks and diaries of both sisters, a biography of Theodore Weld, and much else. An extraordinary collection with an extraordinary scope. The collection is now the cornerstone of the Clements Library's holdings on abolition, women's rights, and social history, and they continue to see frequent, regular use in our reading room. Scholarly consultation of the Weld-Grimke family papers is superseded only by use of the library's great Revolutionary War manuscripts. A bibliography of books and articles which have relied on the 1939 and other Demond editions of Weld and Grimke papers would be extensive. And I had created a list of them, but for fear of leaving some out and some in, I won't read through them. I chose this as a cover because I'm delighted by the 1974 cover design. This is the first proper biography of Angelina Grimké. And these are the spines of the two works that Dwight Demond compiled, the two on the left from the Weld papers and the two on the right from a different set of papers, those of James G. Burney. Apart from Barnes and Dumond's 1930s transcriptions, many letters, essays, and notebooks from these early acquisitions have been transcribed, edited, and published. Dissertations on aspects of slavery, religious reform, abolition, dietary reform, and women's rights continue to be written with these papers as a source. And from this point on, I'll be talking about this green line from Angelina and Theodore papers that were collected or handed down to Sarah Grimké Weld and through the families. That's this box and other materials that we have here at the Clements. I'll begin with an example. This example is actually a 2012 purchase from a private dealer, the same year we received that box. In it, Sarah described in detail the ceremony of her sister Angelina's marriage on May 15th, 1838, and the following day's anti-slavery convention at Pennsylvania Hall. It was a progressive wedding indeed, with explicit discussions of husband-wife equality and an overarching anti-slavery theme. And I'll quote from the letter. This is from Sarah Grimké to a friend, written June 10th through July 1st, 1838. Angelina could not conscientiously consent to be married by a minister, and Theodore D. Weld cheerfully consented to have it consummated in such a manner as comported with her views. We all felt that the presence of a magistrate, a stranger, would be unpleasant to us at such a time, and we therefore concluded to invite such of our friends as we desired to have, and have the marriage solemnized as a religious act in a religious and social meeting. Neither Theodore nor Angelina felt as if they could bind themselves to the use of any preconceived form of words, and accordingly altered such as the Lord gave them at the moment. Theodore addressed Angelina in a solemn and tender manner. He alluded to the unrighteous power vested in a husband by the laws of the United States over the person and property of his wife, and he abjured all authority, all government, save the influence which love would give to both of them over each other as moral and immortal beings. I would give much could I recall his words, but I cannot. Angelina's address to him was brief but comprehensive, containing a promise to honor him, to prefer him above herself, to love him with a pure heart fervently. Immediately after we knelt, and dear Theodore poured out his soul in solemn supplication for the blessing of God upon their union, that it might be productive of enlarged usefulness and increased sympathy for the slave. Angelina followed in a melting appeal to our Heavenly Father for the design of their union to glorify Him, and asking His guidance in overshadowing love through the rest of their pilgrimage. A colored Presbyterian minister then prayed and was followed by a white one. And then I felt as if I could not restrain the language of praise and thanksgiving to Him who had condescended to be in the midst of this marriage feast, and to pour forth abundantly the oil of wine and consolation and rejoicing. The Lord Jesus was the first guest invited to be present, and he condescended to bless us with his presence and to sanction and sanctify the union which was thus consummated. The certificate was then signed and read by William Lloyd Garrison and was signed by the company. The evening was spent in pleasant social intercourse. Several colored persons were present, among them 2 liberated slaves who formerly belonged to our father. They were our invited guests, and we thus had an opportunity to bear our testimony against the horrible prejudice which prevails against colored persons and the equally sinful prejudice against the poor. An extraordinary letter, and this gives you a flavor of the type of writing that both sisters were producing and other family members and the network of individuals who were writing to them. This is from the original acquisition in a late 1930s. This is their wedding certificate referred to in this letter we recently acquired. Theodore Weld, Angelina Weld signed, and all of the witnesses, which is basically a who's who of abolitionism and women's rights in late 1930s Philadelphia. Gerrit Smith, James Burney, Henry B. Stanton, Lewis Tappan, Maria Chapman, and many others. An extraordinary document. In 2009, Charlotte Hamilton Mason gave to the library a number of objects that had been passed along to her through the family, including this purse by Angelina Grimké Weld. She carried this with the image of the kneeling slave, a symbol of abolitionism, on her purse at the wedding. In 2009, we were also gifted the family quilt, which is made of the clothing of Eagleswood school students and repaired in the 20th century at some point, as well as a number of photograph albums of Theodore Weld and others, a photograph album of Eagleswood school students. This box contained 961 letters once they were all processed and unfolded. An extraordinary volume of material by all of the parties that I just described as earlier in the talk. It contained around 100 letters from Sarah Moore Grimké to her niece, spanning 1851 to 1869. These letters contain details about Sarah's close relationship with her niece and nephews, which was a source of antagonism between herself and her sister. They provided the sorts of details and anecdotes that will doubtless be used by future researchers and scholars. This previously unknown letter dates from Sarah Grimké's visit to Washington, to Washington, D.C. in 1853. She's writing to her niece and nephews, and she's visiting the Capitol building. Quote from the letter. The passages throughout the entire building are all equally gloomy. I went into the Supreme Court, which was not in session, and was invited to take my seat in the chair occupied by the Chief Justice. When there, I involuntarily exclaimed, "Who knows but a woman may one day preside here?" My companions were much amused and admitted that the signs of the times were rather portentous. One of them, a jovial naval officer, repeated my saying to a dozen gentlemen as we went through the building, introducing me to them, so I shall be known as an advocate of the rights of woman. We went to the senatorial chamber and Hall of Representatives, where I sat in Garrett's seat, and then into the private room of the Speaker of the Senate, where dear old John Quincy Adams breathed his last. His bust stands just where his head lay on the cot. The rotunda is ornamented by 7 large paintings of Trumbull's. The landing of the Pilgrims brought vividly to mind dear little Sissy's piece, which she repeats so sweetly. Among the group is a sick child, a touching and interesting object. The arrival of Columbus is finely portrayed, and I did not recollect until I saw that picture that he had with him a cabin boy about 12 years of age. He has a very fine countenance. One vacancy in the rotunda is unoccupied, and I remarked that when the slaves were emancipated, it might be appropriately filled. A few months later, still in Washington, D.C., she related this anecdote to her niece and their nephews. I must tell you a little circumstance which happened to me, and it made me thankful to dear Heavenly Father. It had ceased raining, and I sallied forth for a long walk. I went out of my usual course, not knowing why, and by that means arrived at the Capitol gate, just in time to prevent a brutal outrage. A tall, stalwart man with a fierce countenance, who looked as if one blow from his fist would knock a man down, went up to a colored lad about 16, and seizing him by the collar, demanded in an angry tone what he said to him yesterday. "Nothing, sir," was the boy's reply. "You did? I heard you, and I'll teach you to sass a white man." "Come along with me," dragging him forcefully into the Capitol yard where he had a large stick, and thus far I had listened in silence. I now approached and inquired what he was going to do with the lad. "Well, I'm going to beat him." "And I entreat you not to do it," said I. "If he has done wrong, forgive him, and I know you will be a great deal happier if you let him go." But he sassed me, and I don't take that from my own color. And then, doubling his fist, he approached so near I trembled lest in his passion he should strike the boy in the face. And I continued to plead for the culprit, and at last, relaxing his muscles, he said, "You see that stick? I had meant to give you a warning with it, but for this that's underlined, old lady's sake, I will let you off." So I sent the boy in a contrary direction and proceeded on my way a little behind the man. We'd not walked far when I had the pleasure of seeing him in a new aspect. A child about 10 approached us in frolic mood. He seemed delighted to see her, greeted her affectionately, and looked so pleasant I could hardly believe he was the same man, whose face a few minutes before was inflamed by anger, and his voice uttering tones of revenge and passion. And I learned another lesson of human nature. We're two beings, just as the evil, so the good spirit has possession of us. Darling sissy, darling boys, let us try to be always under the influence of the good. The box contained around 120 of Angelina and Theodore's daughter, Sarah Weld, later Hamilton's letters, including a fine group of them from Sarah Weld during her time at the offices of the Woman's Journal, a suffrage journal and women's rights journal out of Boston. She worked there during the very first weeks of its organization. And they include Sarah's views on women's rights and suffrage, and wonderful descriptions of the office, Julia Ward Howe, and the editors. This is dated November 29th, 1869. I tell you one conclusion I've come to, Will, the recipient, her friend, later husband, that women ought to support themselves. They never can be independent till they do, and I don't think I can respect myself till I do. All this nonsense about woman's dependence on man is pure nonsense and nothing else. Men and women both have God to depend on, and that's enough. There cannot be any robust affection when there's no dependence. Pity and sympathy do us no hearty good. They are specifics, easing the pain for a time. They never can give us grit, and self-reliance does not isolate us from each other. On the other hand, it gives stability to the strong bonds of the family. Emerson says self-reliance is reliance on God, and that hits the nail on the head. I've finished my article, and Father thinks I will have no difficulty in getting it in the Independent. I shall be glad if they pay me for it. Another letter. Yesterday I was writing nearly all day, the day before folding newspapers and another day stamping them. The editors are out a good deal, and I see anyone who calls on business. Mrs. Howe often condescends upon us. Mrs. Livermore is the managing editor, and a true Westerner in all her ways. I was repelled by her at first, but she has such a great heart under her roughness that I think she will do a great deal of good. She has more intellectual ability than any of the other editors. You'll see an article of Lily Chase's on the first page. I heartily hope the paper will succeed. In the spring of 1870, a group of around 40 women marched through Hyde Park to vote in local elections, though they did not have suffrage. March 13th, 1870, she writes to William Hamilton, "Well, we've voted." The occasion passed off pleasantly. There was a driving snowstorm, but we all went with our flowers and quietly dropped our ballots with no molestation from the mob which crammed the building. They left a free passage for us and fell back in silence as we entered. Soon our friends cheered vociferously, and then a few hisses were heard, but soon drowned out. No word was spoken while we were in the building. I'm not surprised that it should seem to you like play voting, but it was far otherwise. I see that this is getting to be a question of importance, and here in the village, people are taking sides one way or the other. In Vermont, where the question is soon to be submitted to the people, it is just so. The church is, as in the old anti-slavery times, naturally wheeling into opposition. The Democratic and Republican papers, about as many Democratic as Republican, are in favor of us and about as many against. I read the last article by a looker-on in The Nation and was delighted with it. She takes the only true position, that of armed neutrality, till her convictions are formed. And our people often err by trying to force people to take sides when they're not fit to do it. My little dentist. I think he really had a liking for me and was sorry when my teeth were done. He said very sadly the last day that he'd had some very pleasant hours in these rooms, and I really do believe he would have offered himself to me if I hadn't snubbed him and changed the subject quick. I like him well. He's a good boy, but what would the little fellow do with a woman's rider? He thinks that he little thinks that I'm a voter. There are other letters from the Woman's Journal in this new acquisition, including, as editors, husband and wife, Henry Blackwell and Lucy Stone. This is an example of one of the 260 letters of Angelina Emily Grimké Weld that were contained in the box. She discussed visiting lecturers, financial matters, health concerns, politics, and much else. In this letter, following the presidential election of Rutherford B. Hayes, she wrote to her daughter about her optimism for improved race relations. This is in March 18th of 1877. She writes, I long to hear what William and yourself think of Hayes's cabinet and his appointment of Frederick Douglass as sheriff of the District of Columbia. How hard it must have been for the Democrats to swallow this, and yet, I suppose as politicians, the hope of the colored vote to help them into office in future reconciled them to it, and so it was confirmed. I'm thinking that just as our Heavenly Father ordained that the abolition of slavery should be accomplished through the quarrel of the North and South with each other, and the consequent war which resulted in the abolition of slavery, so he is working out the most difficult problem of our day in reconciling the black and white races together through the political strife of parties, so that they may receive the Republican principle of Christian equality and universal suffrage. Women will come in as the last recipients of these rights, and I'm ready to wait patiently for come it must in due time when we've grown to it. Very optimistic view in the first case and a pessimistic in the last. Theodore Dwight Weld wrote approximately 180 letters in the box offering advice on education, reassurance about Sarah's intellectual development, and news about his activities and current events, family and financial matters, and recollections of his younger days. He referenced major socio-political issues at the time and his own speaking engagements. One topic of discussion were the Grimké sisters' nephews, Archibald, Francis Grimké. Angelina and Sarah had learned of the existence of their nephews in 1868. They were sons of Sarah and Angelina's brother, Henry Grimké, and Nancy Weston, one of his slaves. The sisters and Theodore Weld met the young man while they were both studying at Pennsylvania's Lincoln University and went on to financially support their education. Francis Grimké studied law at Howard University before attending Princeton Theological Seminary to become a minister. Archibald Grimké studied law at Harvard University and was admitted to the bar in Boston in 1875. He served as the United States Consul to Santo Domingo, 1894 to 98. The new addition to the Weld and Grimké family papers don't contain any of Archibald or Francis's letters, but contain many remarks and discussions about them in the hands of Sarah, Angelina, and Theodore. This is an example of one of the remarks that Theodore makes on February 23rd of 1883. He writes to his daughter, "Thanks for the paper slip about Dr. Grimké. Francis, had just been left here the day before your letter came, having been spending a week with Archie." It's Archibald. Archie spent a week with him last month, going on specially to see his brother, who you know now lives with Frank in Washington. Frank preached one sermon for us, some in the Orthodox Church, while here, both admirable sermons. Intellectually and spiritually, he is a member of the Washington Presbytery, embracing about 40 ministers, Frank the only colored one. They elect a moderator of the body annually. He's moderator for the present ecclesiastical year, and already has laid his hands upon the heads of a number of white candidates in the ordaining service. The contents of the box were assembled by Angelina Grimké Hamilton, who contributed 30 letters which she wrote between 1878 and 1899, offering insight into her early education and work towards becoming a physician. You see her, these are both pictures from the 1908 Michigansian. This is a graduating class, medical class of 1908. She and 3 other women are in the upper left-hand corner of the picture. To close my portion of the talk, I'd like to show you this manuscript, which is absolutely remarkable. It's in Sarah Weld Hamilton's hand, and it's providing a list of attendees at a reception for her father, Theodore Dwight Weld. This group gathered at the offices of the Woman's Journal on the 56th anniversary of the Boston riot of 1835, the same riot that prompted Angelina Grimké to write the letter to William Lloyd Garrison that began her career as an abolitionist. This is the tip of the iceberg for this collection. 900 and some letters. Theodore wrote as many as 20, 30 pages in some letters. It's an absolutely extraordinary body of materials for future scholarly research, and we're immensely grateful to be able to share them with scholars at the Clements Library. And with that, I'll turn it over to Tessa Wakefield, who worked on trying to make these materials accessible. So thanks.
Okie dokie. So my name is Tessa Wakefield, and I am a second-year graduate student at the School of Information, where I'm specializing in archives and records management. I've been working at the Clements in the Manuscripts division for about 1.5 years and spent the past summer processing this addition to the Weld-Grimke family papers. It was a project I thoroughly enjoyed doing, and I learned quite a bit, both about the content and people in the papers, as well as the archival practices necessary to processing such a collection. I'd like to walk you all through the steps and various components that were part of arranging and describing this collection in order to make it accessible to researchers. One of the most important considerations for this collection, and really any archival processing project, is addressing the concept of original order. This is defined as the order in which a collection arrived at the library. It may have been determined by the creator, or it was gathered that way by the person who last owned the collection. It can be a pretty tricky business determining if a collection has been organized in a meaningful way or just dumped willy-nilly into a box. So the overarching question we had to ask was, how do we get from this trunk and its assorted bundles, which is what this image represents, to an accessible, well-organized collection for researchers? We didn't know if the bundles needed to be preserved intact as they arrived at the library. And we asked ourselves, was there inherent meaning in them? That was the major issue. Were these bundles organized that way for specific reasons? If so, we certainly did not want to disrupt that process. However, before making that final decision, we had to actually look at the items and the materials themselves. Kay Miller, the library volunteer you heard about earlier, has spent countless hours delving into the 2012 acquisition. Here she is, hanging out with some of the papers over there. And she compiled extensive notes, which is demonstrated by this screenshot, and compiled extensive notes on each bundle and its individual letters, including any envelopes that accompanied them. Each bundle received a number so that it was easily discernible as to which letters went with which bundle. The original order of the collection was therefore well documented, meaning that in the future, if someone wanted to arrange the collection as it originally arrived at the library, they could go back and do so. Her notes actually really provided a solid foundation to build upon when I began the processing of the collection. The first step in the project was to create a comprehensive item-level inventory of both the library's existing collection and the 2012 acquisition. On a personal level, doing this inventory allowed me to further familiarize myself with the collection's contributors, like the Weld-Grimkes and their various associates, as well as learn more about the major themes that are prominent in the collection. The main purpose of the inventory, however, was to provide a document that included every item of correspondence in the collection, which now totals 2,986 items. It provides basic information about each letter, including the date, writer, recipient, location, and descriptive notes, which you can see in these two examples. A nice feature of the inventory is, since it is in spreadsheet form, the fields in the document can be sorted in many different ways. We can sort it according to writer, so that it alphabetizes the inventory by last name and therefore lets us see who wrote what and how many letters. You can also sort it chronologically by recipient, location, really by any of these fields, which allows you to look at it in a more varied way and look at the data from different perspectives. This inventory is now accessible to researchers and staff in the reading room, providing a wealth of information for those using the collection. Additionally, the inventory was used to generate a comprehensive writer's index that now accompanies the collection's finding aid. This supplementary document lists every person or organization that wrote a letter, as well as to whom they are writing, along with the dates of their letters. It's yet another tool that researchers may use to access the collection and familiarize themselves with the contributors, especially if you're new to the collection. And something we also did was, if you look at the bottom with the asterisks, it indicates which letters came with the new acquisition, so you can differentiate between the old and new, as well as points out which items had been published in the Dumont book that was mentioned earlier. Once the inventory was completed, the next step was to physically arrange the items themselves in an effective, accessible manner. After consulting with the curator, it was decided that the correspondence should be arranged chronologically, mainly due to the overlap in the content between the original collection and the new acquisition. In other words, we just combined the two acquisitions into one continuous flow of correspondence. It simply did not make much sense to keep the two separate from one another. At this point, decisions had to be made as to whether or not to keep those bundles intact as they had arrived at the library. The decision did vary from bundle to bundle. Some were kept together, while others were separated into individual parts. Examples of bundles that remained together included those with enclosures or forwarded letters. One bundle that was tied with string consisted of different letters within it. It was dated December 21st, 1891, and was sent from Charles Stewart Weld to his sister Sarah Weld Hamilton. In it, Stewart comments on family news and the holidays, and also mentions that his son Lewis has written a thank you note to Sarah. Lewis's note was included in this bundle, was tied in there with that original top letter. Therefore, the bundle was maintained. Another example is that many of Angelina Grimké Weld's later letters to her daughter also included little notes to her granddaughter, Angelina. So those bundles were kept together. The main point was whatever was sent and received together was kept together, because that was their original purpose, was to be received and sent in that fashion. Others were taken apart after determining that the bundled materials were not related to one another. So for example, a letter in some of the bundles could have been from 1860 and another one from 1867. They focused on different subjects, were written by different people. And so it was more obvious that those items had not been originally together in the first place. Therefore, we felt comfortable splitting them up and just integrating them into the chronological run. Regardless of whether a bundle is maintained or split, the original order and composition of all bundles was documented during the inventory process. So then the actual process of arranging the letters and combining the two acquisitions was not a really high-tech process, and it probably was one of my favorite stages of the project. It consisted of grouping the letters by decade and then by specific year. This was done by laying sticky notes out on different tables in the library's workspace. Each sticky note was labeled with a year, and letters were sorted into the correct piles. I think this was one of my favorite parts because it was immensely satisfying to lay out all 2,000 plus letters and organize them into a nice cohesive group of materials. Once this task was completed, it was time to refolder and rebox the items. The existing collection had been arranged with each individual item getting its own folder, and that's what this far image is an example of the original folders. As you can see, the folder contained basic information about the letter, such as the writer, recipient, date, and location. If this sounds familiar, it's because we use these exact fields in our final inventory. However, these original folders were highly acidic, so the decision was made to use new folders after combining the acquisitions. Since the information from those folders was already represented in the spreadsheet, we knew that we wouldn't be losing any important information by using new folders. Additionally, new archival boxes were also incorporated, so we moved from using these old black and blue kind of upright boxes into new archival storage boxes. So these are images of how the collection is now arranged and housed. Each new folder contains between 5 to 20 letters, and that's this bottom picture here. Depending on a few factors, if a letter's older, you're gonna have less older letters in a folder together. The folders and boxes are both of high archival quality, which is important in ensuring long-term preservation. The top images are examples of the labeling put on each folder, and so this far one each folder includes the date range of the materials in there, as well as the box and folder number and the total number of items in each folder. And then that image is of the new boxes. And overall with this component, I have to say it's a good feeling to put fresh labels on newly organized boxes and see them looking pristine on the shelves. And after that final process of getting the labels on and getting the final physical materials all together, we moved on to revising the finding aid. So the final major component of the project was revising and adding to the collection's existing finding aid. A finding aid is the guide that accompanies collections and provides information regarding what a collection contains, including biographical information, a scope and content note, and subject terms. The existing collection already had a finding aid that represented the contents of that collection. With the new acquisition, it was necessary to revise and update the finding aid to reflect the new people and items now present. General housekeeping and administrative matters relating to the collection were in need of updates. In the summary information section, then the dates were updated to reflect the new acquisition, as was the linear footage. Another major update was the biographical note, as people who are now prominently featured due to the new acquisition needed to be included. So this far image here at the bottom is an example of one paragraph that gives a brief background sketch of Sarah Grimké Weld Hamilton and her daughter Angelina Grimké Hamilton. They had not been included in the original finding aid because they didn't have materials that were within that collection. But with the advent of their contributions, they required a little biographical sketch. Other general areas that were updated were the total number of items, as well as the total number of items each prominent writer in the collection contributed. The scope and content note also required extensive updating and revisions. Sections designated to the Weld children, Stuart, Sarah, and Sodie, were added, as were those of other Weld family members, and examples of notable items that they wrote. One notable revision to the existing content was in Theodore Dwight Weld section. We discovered that a list of his professional correspondence was missing some fairly major individuals. Listed were men including William Lloyd Garrison, Lewis Tappan, and Gerrit Smith, who certainly were important figures in the abolitionist movement. That being said, women were noticeably absent from that list, despite the fact that Weld did indeed correspond with women. In fact, some pretty big names from the 19th century. Women in general were major contributors to the social reform movements of the time and to this collection in particular. For example, the Grimké sisters were listed as other correspondents of Weld's, despite the fact that many of their letters focused on abolitionism and other social reform matters, not just issues of a personal nature. Additionally, the names of other major female activists were omitted, including those of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Sarah Mapps Douglas, and Lucy Stone. And so that's what this is showing. The top is the original finding aid text, and so it lists Weld's various correspondents, who were very important people, but if you can see in the very last sentence, other letters are from his parents, his siblings, and the Grimké sisters, and so they weren't included in his list of correspondence in a professional context, even before he was a part of their family. And so in this bottom one, this is our revised finding aid text, which now inserts the Grimké sisters up into that list, as well as includes the numerous women that are represented and wrote letters in this collection. So overall, the new finding aid has now incorporated these women into Weld's correspondence list, therefore becoming a more accurate reflection of the collection's contents. Finally, the subject terms section of the finding aid was updated. For example, the contributors list and subject headings using the Library of Congress's name authority file. The box and folder list, which is used by researchers to request parts of the collection, also needed revision to reflect the new organization of the boxes. And so that's what that far image just lists some of the contributors. There were numerous, so I couldn't fit it onto the screen, from the Library of Congress. And then this list is how researchers can request whatever box they need to pursue their personal research. And so that is the process of going through an archival collection.
Thank you. And this would originally have been the conclusion of our talk. However, in the last couple of weeks, we're delighted that Tom Mason, who provided us with the original box for this new acquisition, whose mother had retained this correspondence from her Aunt Angelina Weld Hamilton, is here with us tonight, and he is going to present new materials and say a few words about his family, and we're deeply grateful for that. So, Tom Mason.
Thanks, Cheney. As Cheney and Tessa mentioned, my family's been associated with the Clements Library for decades. My mother, Charlotte Hamilton Mason, graduated from the University of Michigan in 1937, and by all accounts, she had a great time and received a great education. She studied with Dwight Weld, who inspired her research into her family, which had been involved with, as Cheney pointed out, the anti-slavery movement during the previous century. Then she and her aunt, Angelina Grimké Hamilton, known in the family as Aunt Nina, also another University of Michigan alumna. She, as Cheney pointed out, graduated from the medical school in 1908. They took a trip to Shipshewana, Indiana, where Dr. Hamilton had practiced medicine early in her career, and there was a gap of some decades. That is, by 1940, I think it was between 40 and 50 years before that she'd actually practiced in Shipshewana. But there, according to family lore, in a barn was that box, that crate. And as before tonight's meeting, Cheney and I were looking at the shipping label, and evidently what happened was they went to Shipshewana, recovered the crate, and then had it shipped from Shipshewana to Port Huron, where my mother was living in 1940. What we're going to present this evening are the family Bibles, first of Sarah Grimké, and then the family Bible of Angelina Grimké. So I'll have a couple of quick comments about those. The Sarah Grimké Bible is inscribed by Richards Johnson to Sarah, January 12th, 1825, in Philadelphia, where she had recently moved from South Carolina in just 4 years previously, 1821. It's a King James version, translation of the Bible, published in New York, 1922, and contains some marginal notes, so it'll be of interest beyond just bibliographical. It's got Grimké content in it. Then this larger Bible was published in Philadelphia by the Bible Association of Friends in America in 1831. I did a little research and found that this Bible Association of Friends in America was a Quaker organization founded only 2 years before, in 1829, and it still exists. And it's inscribed by Sarah Grimké to her sister, Angelina. The inscription is from March of 1831. Angelina had moved to Philadelphia, as Cheney pointed out, 2 years previously and had joined the Society of Friends, the Quakers. It also contains marginal notes and a register recording the marriage of Angelina to Theodore Dwight Weld in 1838, and also the births of their children, Charles Stewart Weld, Theodore Grimke Weld, and Sarah Grimké Weld. So it's a great pleasure to present these Bibles to the Clements Library. So.
is extraordinary. Again, I'd like to thank Tom Mason and his family for preserving the materials that we've recently acquired in the last half a dozen years, and also to other families elsewhere who are preserving their own family history. We're absolutely delighted to be able to care for these at the Clements Library and provide access to them to scholars and other researchers. So with that, thanks again, Tom. And that's it. Thank you. And as we're running a little late, we'll be around happy to answer questions, but rather than stand up here and field them, I think we'll end with this. So thank you very much.